There exists a place on the planet where the three great oceans of the southern hemisphere collide without land to stop them, where the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Southern Ocean merge into a single mass of water that rotates around Antarctica without encountering obstacles for tens of millions of years. That place has a name, the Drake Passage, or Mar de Horses for those who claim its Spanish designation. It is the stretch of sea that separates the southern tip of South America from the Antarctic continent, and for centuries it was the only possible route for anyone wishing to pass from the Atlantic to the Pacific without going around Africa. It was not a choice, it was a necessity, and that necessity came at a very high cost. It is estimated that between the 16th and 20th centuries, around 800 shipwrecks occurred in these waters, with a death toll ranging between 10,000 and 20,000 sailors. On Hornos Island, there is today a monument in their memory. The ocean took most of the traces, but some remain on beaches that almost no one visits, in chronicles of sailors who wrote their final pages before sinking, or in the naval archives of countries that sent warships to this corner of the world and waited for news that never arrived. To understand why this strip of water is so lethal, one must understand what makes it different from any other sea in the world. It is not only the wind, nor only the waves, nor only the cold. It is the combination of factors that does not occur at any other latitude on the planet, and that has its roots in geology, oceanography, and meteorology at the same time. Understanding that combination is also understanding why the geography of the southern world determined the course of trade, exploration, and war for 3 centuries. About 41 million years ago, the Antarctic continent was joined to South America. When tectonic plates finally separated them, a channel opened between both landmasses, and something unprecedented in the planet's history occurred. An ocean current began to flow from west to east around Antarctica without encountering any continental obstacle to slow it down. Thus was born the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, also called the West Wind Drift, the most powerful and voluminous ocean current in the world. The volume of water carried by this current is difficult to imagine. It moves approximately between 100 and 150 million cubic meters per second, which is equivalent to about 600 times the flow of the Amazon River. All that mass of water, upon reaching the Drake Passage, is forced to pass through the narrowest corridor of its circumpolar route, barely 800 kilometers wide, between Cape Horn and the South Shetland Islands. As the channel narrows, the current accelerates. The waters become turbulent, eddies multiply, and the ocean's kinetic energy is concentrated in a relatively small space. Added to this is the behavior of the wind. In the southern hemisphere, the continents become progressively narrower as latitude decreases, until between 40 and 65 degrees south, they practically disappear. This means that the circumpolar winds traveling from west to east can literally circle the planet without encountering mountain ranges, coastal barriers, or any land relief to slow them down. In the northern hemisphere, the same winds constantly collide with Europe, Asia, and North America, losing energy. In the southern hemisphere, they strengthen indefinitely. The navigators who experienced those latitudes gave them names that reflect exactly what they encountered. The roaring 40s are the winds that blow continuously between 40 and 50 degrees south latitude. The furious 50s dominate between 50 and 60 degrees, and the screaming 60s mark the band closest to the Antarctic Circle. Each of these bands has its own meteorological personality, but they all share the same essence: winds that do not stop, that can reach 130 kilometers per hour under ordinary conditions, and that generate waves of extraordinary proportions. There is an additional physical effect that 19th century navigators knew from experience, even though they could not explain it theoretically. The Patagonian Andes and the Antarctic Peninsula function as a funnel that further concentrates and accelerates winds in the passage, so that airspeed in the corridor between the two continents frequently exceeds that recorded in the open sea at the same latitude. The waves of the Drake Passage are a direct product of that combination. Sustained wind acts on the water's surface over thousands of kilometers of unobstructed travel, transferring energy cumulatively. The result is waves that can commonly exceed 15 meters in height, and that in severe storm conditions reach and exceed 20 meters. Some accounts from modern navigators record waves of up to 25 meters. The waves of the Drake Passage are not only high, they are long, with periods of up to 18 seconds between crest and crest, which generates a rolling motion that destroys the stability of any vessel not specifically designed to withstand it. When successive storm fronts arrive from different directions with slight variations in angle, they create what oceanographers call a cross swell, a pattern of waves that intersect at angles the ship cannot anticipate, and that produce three-dimensional jolts on the hull. Temperature adds another layer of danger. The water in this area ranges between 2 and 6 degrees Celsius, depending on the time of year and the specific currents in which the navigator finds themselves. At those temperatures, a human who falls into the water loses the ability for coordinated movement within a few minutes. Incapacitating hypothermia sets in between 10 and 30 minutes. Death, without rescue, occurs in less than an hour. During the centuries of sailing navigation, falling into the water in the Drake Passage was equivalent to death. The cold also plays an active role on the structure of ships. When the icy Antarctic air comes into contact with water spray produced by the waves, ice forms on exposed surfaces. Over the course of a few hours, that accumulation can add tons of weight to the upper parts of the ship. The masts, yards, and rigging become heavy and unmanageable. The vessel's center of gravity rises dangerously, and stability disappears even without any large wave striking the hull. Sailors of 19th century sailing ships described entire days of forced labor, chipping ice from the rigging with axes and mallets, exposed to wind and cold, unable to stop because stopping meant the ship would begin to tilt. To all these factors is added the presence of icebergs. Antarctic melting releases icebergs that drift north carried by currents. In historical times, without radar, without positioning systems, and with visibility frequently reduced by fog and snow, an iceberg could appear without warning just meters from the bow. 90% of an iceberg's mass lies beneath the water's surface, making the visible portion an unreliable guide to its true size. In foggy conditions, which are common in the passage, the first sign of an iceberg was often the sound of ice tearing the hull. Fog in the Drake Passage is dense and persistent. It forms when moist air from the north comes into contact with the cold waters of the Circumpolar Current. The False Cape Horn, a rock formation on Host Island, 56 kilometers northwest of the true Cape, had a silhouette similar to the profile of the real Cape when seen from the west. Numerous ships mistook one for the other and found themselves in a completely different geographical position than they believed once the fog cleared. Finally, the area is seismically active. The region sits on the Scotia Plate, a tectonic fragment between the South American and Antarctic plates. Movements between these plates generate constant seismic activity, with frequent underwater earthquakes that can produce sudden variations in oceanographic conditions. Although earthquakes on the seabed of the passage do not usually produce large tsunamis, those that occur along the Chilean coast, which is among the most seismically active areas on the planet, can do so, adding an unpredictable threat to an environment that already accumulates too many. Before the passage had a name, before maps represented it correctly, there existed, in the imagination of European cartographers, a firmly rooted idea. South of Tierra del Fuego, there was no open sea, but land. A colossal continental mass called Terra Australis Incognita, which in the hypotheses of the time had to exist to balance the weight of the lands of the Northern Hemisphere. That idea was not only an aesthetic whim of geographers, it was a philosophical conviction so deeply rooted that it directly influenced the decisions of captains and sponsors of expeditions. In 1519, when Ferdinand Magellan departed from San Lucar de Barrameda with 5 ships and around 250 men in search of a western route to the Spice Islands, no one knew with certainty whether a passage south of America existed. Magellan carefully guarded information that had reached him from Portuguese sources, the conviction that a passage existed, although no one had documented it. His expedition sailed for months southward along the American coast, enduring the southern winter in the Bay of San Julian. There, hunger, cold, and desperation triggered a mutiny in which the captains of 3 of the 5 ships attempted to force Magellan to return to Spain. Magellan suppressed the uprising with calculated brutality. He ordered the execution of Captain Luis de Mendoza and the abandonment on Patagonian land of Juan de Cartagena and a rebellious priest. In May 1520, before resuming the journey, the ship Santiago sank while exploring the mouth of a river during a storm. On the 21st of October 1520, with 4 of the 5 original ships, Magellan found the entrance to the strait that would bear his name. It took him more than a month to cross it, sending exploration boats to find the route through the labyrinth of channels, islands, and blind passages that characterize that geography. The fires that the Fuegian natives lit on the shores gave their name to the land they were skirting, Tierra del Fuego. During the crossing, the ship San Antonio deserted. Its pilot, Esteban Gomez, seized command by force and set course for Spain with 59 crew members who never saw their companions again. On the 28th of November, 1520, the 3 remaining ships exited the strait and entered what Magellan named the Pacific Ocean. However, neither Magellan nor Elcano had crossed the Drake Passage. They had taken the inner route among the archipelagos. The open sea south of Cape Horn remained, for Europeans, an unknown. Magellan never returned to Spain. He died on the 27th of April 1521 in the Philippines, on the beach of Mactan, during a battle against local forces that outnumbered him. Juan Sebastián Elcano took command and completed the first circumnavigation of the globe on the 6th of September 1522, arriving in Sanlúcar de Barrameda with 18 survivors. Out of 5 ships, only the Victoria returned, in such a precarious state that it had to be towed upriver to Seville. The human cost of the first voyage around the world, considered the greatest milestone of maritime exploration, had been the lives of more than 200 people. The change in the perception of the southernmost end of the continent came in 1525, although in an accidental and controversial manner. Francisco de Hoses, pilot of Garcia Jofre de Loaisa's expedition, was sailing in the caravel San Lesmes when a storm dragged him south, away from the Strait of Magellan. Sources indicate that he reached 55 degrees south latitude, which would place him in the waters of the passage. However, he did not cross it. The storm forced him to return to the strait. The Royal Academy of History of Spain has formally dismissed that Hoses was the discoverer of the passage, arguing that an involuntary drift caused by a storm without precise cartographic documentation does not constitute a geographical discovery. However, in Spain and in several Spanish-speaking countries, the body of water bears his name. In 1578, Francis Drake completed the picture in an equally involuntary way. Sailing with his Golden Hind during his circumnavigation of the globe, he crossed the Strait of Magellan without incident and began to advance north through the Pacific. An exceptional storm lasting several days dragged him south and east, pushing his ship beyond the coasts of Tierra del Fuego until he saw no land in any direction on the horizon. Drake did not cross the passage that bears his name. He was thrown into its waters by the weather, and when the storm subsided, he returned north. The fact that his ship had survived at those latitudes, and that he had not found the continuation of the continent south of Tierra del Fuego, was, however, information of strategic value that the English Navy recorded. The name Drake Passage was born from that British cartography, not from any deliberate nautical achievement of the corsair. The first deliberate and documented rounding of Cape Horn occurred on the 29th of January 1616, although it came wrapped in circumstances that mixed tragedy with irony. Isaac Lemaire, a Belgian Huguenot merchant established in Holland after fleeing Antwerp, had founded the Australian Company with the aim of competing with the all-powerful Dutch East India Company, the VOC. The VOC had the legal monopoly on routes through the Strait of Magellan and the Cape of Good Hope. If another path to the Moluccas existed, it would be outside that monopoly. Isaac placed his son Jacob in charge of the expedition and hired the experienced captain Willem Schouten to command the Eendracht. The second ship, the Horn, had Schouten's brother as captain. They departed from Texel in June 1615 with 87 men. The voyage south was relatively orderly until, in January 1616, while attempting to clean the hull of the Horn of marine organisms that slowed it down, they burned the bottom of the ship as a cleaning method, and the fire got out of control. The Horn burned completely and sank. From that moment on, the entire expedition depended on a single ship. On the 25th of January, 1616, they discovered the strait between Tierra del Fuego and the island they named Staten Island, the Lemaire Strait. 4 days later, on January 29, they rounded the southernmost tip of the American continent and gave it a name, Cap Horn, in honor of the lost ship and Schouten's hometown. It was the first time that a European ship documented having rounded that point and entered the Pacific by that route, also demonstrating that Tierra del Fuego was not the edge of any southern continent, but an island. The reception in Batavia, the VOC headquarters in the East Indies, was not as expected. Jan Pieters Cohen, the governor, simply did not believe that they had found a new route. He arrested them, confiscated the Eendracht, and sent them back to Europe as passengers on another expedition. Jacob Lemaire died during the return voyage, without having been able to see his discovery recognized. His father spent years fighting in the courts until, in 1622, he obtained financial compensation and legal recognition of the route. The final irony: the competing company that claimed the rights to that route was the Dutch West India Company, not the Lemaire Australian Company. Jacob had given his life for a route that his enemies ended up exploiting. When the Panama Canal did not exist, and the Strait of Magellan was a dangerous route due to its narrowness and its unpredictable katabatic winds called willywows, Cape Horn became the main route of maritime trade between the Atlantic and the Pacific. During the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, thousands of ships attempted to round the Cape, as it was said in seafaring language. Most succeeded. A significant fraction did not. The worst enemy of sailing ships at Cape Horn was not the waves, although the waves killed, it was direction. The prevailing winds blow from west to east, which means that a ship attempting to go from Buenos Aires to Valparaiso was literally sailing against the wind. To advance westward under headwinds, sailing ships had to perform long tacks, zigzagging between southern Tierra del Fuego and Antarctic latitudes, gaining kilometers westward obliquely. Captains described entire weeks in which the ship advanced only a few net kilometers westward during the day, only to be pushed back several kilometers during the night. Some ships spent months trying to round the Cape without succeeding, until their provisions ran out or their crews became too weakened to maneuver. The willywow, in the inland channels of Tierra del Fuego and the Strait of Magellan, added the factor of total unpredictability. They are bursts of katabatic wind that rush down from the slopes of the mountains without any warning, reaching speeds of more than 100 kilometers per hour in a matter of seconds. In narrow channels, where there is no room to maneuver, a willywow can capsize a vessel before the captain has time to order any action. The ship is safe, and the next instant, it is not. The narrowness of the Strait of Magellan also multiplied the risk of running aground on coastal rocks. The sailors who managed to round Cape Horn from east to west belonged to an informal but recognized fraternity, the Cap Horniers. The right to wear a gold earring in the left ear was the symbol of that achievement. Those who had completed the double crossing, out and back, wore 2 earrings. It was a distinction earned through blood and wind, which granted the sailor the right to sit with one leg crossed on the table during dinner on board, a privilege that in the strict system of naval hierarchies of the time meant a great deal. In 1937, in St. Malo, the Amicale Internationale des Capitaines au Long Cours Cap Horniers was founded, the formal fraternity of those who had rounded the Cape in command of a vessel. When the organization stopped admitting new members because there were no longer any active sailing ship captains, it began to fade away. In 2003, it ceased its activities because the last of its members had died. The year 1905 condensed in a few weeks what Cape Horn could do in its worst version. During that season, 53 sailing ships that attempted to round the Cape did not succeed. Some were wrecked, others were so severely damaged that they had to be abandoned, others managed to flee east and seek refuge in Patagonian Atlantic ports with their hulls destroyed. It was a year that remained etched in the collective memory of the world merchant navy. The Chilean Navy also has its own tragedies in this scenario. The frigate O'Higgins, sold to the government of Buenos Aires in 1826, sank with the 506 people it carried on board south of the Cape. The brigantine Pizarro of the Chilean Navy disappeared between March 7 and 9, 1859, while heading to Valparaiso. No remains of the ship were ever found, nor any news of its crew, which included soldiers of the relief garrison of the colony of Magellan along with their families. The records of the Ushuaia Maritime Museum account for dozens of shipwrecks from the 19th century alone in the immediate area of the Cape. Among those documented, the American frigate Astral sunk on the 21st of August 1867 after colliding with an island. The English frigate Dreadnought wrecked on the 4th of July 1869, whose crew were rescued 17 days later by a Norwegian bark, the American frigate Japon, which caught fire on the 26th of August 1870, and whose crew were saved by the English bark Cecilia. The English bark James W. Elwell, in which only the captain, a sailor, and a woman survived. The French frigate Reserve disappeared on the 5th of October 1872, along with the captain, the first officer, and 4 sailors who had remained on board to try to save it, while the rest of the crew was rescued by a Norwegian vessel. The German bark, Eugenia, sank in October 1875. The Spanish schooner Perseverancia was wrecked at Cape Horn in 1872. The Wager was part of a fleet of 7 ships, under the command of Admiral George Anson, sent by the British Navy with a specific mission to round Cape Horn, enter the Pacific, and attack Spain's coastal possessions in Chile and Peru while the two empires were at war. At the same time, a Spanish fleet under Admiral Jorge Pizarro departed from Santander with exactly the same objective: to arrive before the English and wait for them at Cape Horn to engage in battle. Neither squadron knew of the other's existence when they set sail. Cape Horn treated both with the same indifference. At the end of February 1741, both fleets coincided in the waters of the passage without engaging, disoriented and scattered by storms. Pizarro's ships suffered such severe losses that they had to abort the entire mission. More than half of the Spanish squadron perished in the storms before completing the crossing. Anson's ships were similarly dispersed, although some managed to continue. The Wager, under the command of Captain David Cheap, crossed the Cape with severe damage, the mizzenmast broken, the crew weakened by typhus, scurvy and dysentery, and a geographical position that no one on board could calculate with certainty. They were sailing by ear, trying to recognize the coast through fog and storms. On the morning of the 14th of May, 1741, the Wager ran aground on the rocks of the Guayaneco archipelago, south of the Gulf of Pinos, on the Chilean Pacific coast. The officers had warned the captain the previous night that something was wrong with the position calculations. If they were sailing north, as he insisted, the continent should be visible to the east, not to the west. Cheap rejected the warnings. A wave struck the shattered hull forward and wedged it between 2 large rocks, which allowed the men to reach land in the boats. On land, they found an island without resources, with temperatures hovering near freezing and no possible contact with the outside world. Without sufficient food, at below freezing temperatures and weakened by disease, the castaways quickly split into two factions. Captain Cheap insisted on continuing north to meet Anson on Juan Fernandez Island. A majority of the crew, led by the gunner John Bulkley, preferred to return east through the Strait of Magellan and the Atlantic, arguing that Anson would already have abandoned the rendezvous point. The confrontation was violent. Cheap shot a midshipman in the face during a dispute, although he did not kill him. Later accounts by different survivors diverge on the details of what happened next, but they agree on the essentials. There was cannibalism among the most desperate. There were murders, and most of the castaways died on the island or in attempts to leave it. A group of 81 men under Bulkley departed east in an improvised vessel made from the remains of the Wager, named Speedwell. After more than 3 months and 5,000 kilometers of navigation, including the crossing of the Strait of Magellan, 30 of them reached Brazil. Captain Cheap and a small group of loyalists, including the 7-year-old midshipman John Byron, were rescued by Kawescar indigenous people who guided them for months through the Patagonian channels, navigating routes known only to those canoeing peoples, until Chiloé. There, Spanish soldiers captured them. Byron spent nearly 2 years as a prisoner before being repatriated. The name John Byron matters for 2 reasons that go beyond the shipwreck. The first is that this teenage seaman published in 1768 his account of the events, a document that describes with exceptional clarity what it means to survive in the Patagonian archipelagos in the 18th century. The second is that John Byron was the grandfather of the poet George Gordon Byron, Lord Byron. The famous poet knew well his grandfather's adventures and incorporated them into his imagination. In the poem Don Juan, there are passages that describe shipwrecks and survival at sea that resonate directly with the experience of the Wager. In addition, the shipwreck had concrete geographical consequences. The presence of castaways, and later of explorers sent to search for them, was the beginning of the cartographic recognition of Western Patagonia, a third of Chile's coastline that until then was terra incognita on all European maps. The sea that rounded Cape Horn and devoured ships ended up being also the involuntary driver of the exploration of an entire region. In May 1819, Spain found itself in a desperate situation. The American colonial empire was collapsing under the pressure of independence movements. Fernando VII, determined to send naval reinforcements to the Viceroyalty of Peru to support royalist troops, hastily organized the South Sea Division, 4 ships with 1,400 men on board. The problem was that the ships were in terrible condition. The ship Alejandro I, purchased from Russia with the compensation paid by Great Britain for the suppression of the Spanish slave trade, had a hull so deteriorated that it began to take on water while crossing the equator and had to return to Cadiz. Only 2 months before departure, people close to the expedition's command warned that the condition of the ships made the voyage practically suicidal. Command fell to Brigadier Rosendo Porlier, a Lima-born sailor veteran of the Battle of Trafalgar, who knew perfectly well what it meant to round Cape Horn in the middle of the austral winter. When saying goodbye to his close friend Captain Francisco Espelius in the port of Cadiz, he said, "Goodbye, Francisquito, probably until eternity." It was not a literary premonition. It was the cold calculation of an experienced sailor assessing the condition of his ships against the conditions he was about to face. The 3 remaining ships reached the Drake Passage at the end of August 1819, at the worst time of year to attempt to round the Cape. Successive storms struck the flotilla with such violence that they were forced to separate. The San Telmo, already 30 years in service and poorly maintained during years of war, suffered critical damage. The rudder was damaged, the beakhead gave way, and the main yard broke. Currents and wind pushed the ship south. On the 2nd of September 1819, the frigate Primorosa Mariana sighted the San Telmo for the last time. From its deck they wrote in the logbook that the ship had serious damage to the rudder and rigging and was drifting south with the rudder disabled. The recorded position was 62 degrees south latitude, 70 degrees west longitude, coordinates that placed it already in Antarctic waters. The two frigates managed to continue and arrived in Callao with a month's difference between them. Nothing more was ever heard of the San Telmo and its 644 men. On the 6th of May, 1822, almost 3 years after the disappearance, King Ferdinand VII struck the ship and its 644 sailors from the rolls with a cold administrative note. A few months after the disappearance of the San Telmo, something happened that would change the interpretation of this entire story. The British captain William Smith landed on the 19th of October, 1819, on what is now known as King George Island, part of the South Shetland Islands. Official history recognizes him as the first man to set foot on Antarctica. However, the journal of Captain Robert Fildes, who accompanied Smith on later voyages to the archipelago, records that on the northern coast of Livingston Island, they found the remains of a shipwreck of Spanish typology that had occurred not long before. The figureheads of warships of the Spanish Royal Navy bore a rampant lion. That description appears in the notes of the British explorers when referring to the remains found. Archaeological investigations of recent decades have reinforced the hypothesis that those remains belong to the San Telmo. If so, the Spanish ship would have been dragged by storms to Antarctic coasts in September 1819, 2 months before Smith's landing. Some survivors may have reached that desolate coast alive. The bones of seals, found at the site by later explorers, suggest that someone had been there hunting. The final fate remains undocumented. One theory about the disappearance of the ship's remains points to British seal hunters who began to frequent those islands from 1820 onward. In a territory without a single tree, the wooden remains of a 5.2-meter warship would have been an enormous resource to fuel the portable furnaces where seal fat was rendered. If that occurred, the last physical vestiges of the San Telmo disappeared in the fires of the whaling industry. The 644 men who may have reached Antarctica first left no recognizable mark on the continent that devoured them. The 19th century saw the birth and death of an era that transformed the relationship between navigation and Cape Horn. It was the century of Chilean nitrate. The mines in northern Chile produced a natural fertilizer that Europe demanded in industrial quantities for its agricultural fields and as a component of explosives. Transporting that nitrate from Iquique and Antofagasta to European ports meant crossing Cape Horn on every return voyage, again and again, with cargoes weighing thousands of tons. The great European shipping companies, especially the German F. Leyes, based in Hamburg, designed and built sailing ships specifically for that trade. Steel-hulled vessels with 4 or 5 masts, enormous sail plans, crews reduced to a minimum, and hulls optimized to withstand southern gales. The ships of the Leyes Company all had names beginning with the letter P, which is why they were known as the P-Line, or Flying P-Liners. The Pamir, the Passat, the Peking, the Padua, the Potosi, and the Preußen. All of them crossed Cape Horn dozens of times. The Preußen, built in 1902, was the largest 5-masted sailing ship in the world. It was 147 meters long, had a sail area of 5,560 square meters, and could reach 20 knots with favorable winds. It was so large and so fast that its travel times between Hamburg and Valparaiso competed with those of steamships. It was wrecked in 1910 near Dover, not at Cape Horn, after a collision with a tugboat, with no loss of life. The Pamir, with 4 masts and 114 meters in length, had a longer life and a more dramatic end. Launched in 1905, it was one of the last commercial sailing ships to cross Cape Horn without an auxiliary engine. It did so in July 1949, returning from Australia with a cargo of wheat on a voyage that lasted 128 days. It was the last time in history that a purely sailing commercial vessel rounded Cape Horn with cargo. The era of commercial sail navigation ended in that crossing. The ship entered the Atlantic, past the meridian of Cape Horn with its 4 masts intact, and no one who saw it pass knew that they were witnessing the end of an era that had begun when Magellan set sail from San Luca de Barrameda 4 centuries earlier. The sailing ships of the P-Line also had a characteristic that made them especially formidable at Cape Horn: their size. The largest sailing ships in the world are also the most difficult to maneuver. When the wind changes direction suddenly, as happens with willywaws or with the arrival of a storm front, a 4 or 5-masted sailing ship with thousands of square meters of sail deployed takes minutes to respond to helm orders. In those minutes, the ship may have been displaced hundreds of meters in the wrong direction. The captains of the P-Line were the best of their generation in southern navigation, and even so, they described Cape Horn as an adversary that could never be considered defeated. But the Pamir had one more chapter to write, and it was not in the Drake Passage. On the 21st of September 1957, while sailing from Buenos Aires to Hamburg with 3,780 tons of barley and 86 people on board, including 52 German merchant marine cadets on their first major voyage, it was intercepted by Hurricane Carrie about 1,100 kilometers west-southwest of the Azores. First, they lost the rigging. Then the poorly stowed cargo shifted in the holds and caused the ship to list nearly 30 degrees to port, putting the lifeboats on that side underwater. Only 6 people survived. 80 sailors died. The last of the great P-Line sailing ships did not sink at Cape Horn but in the North Atlantic, yet it did so in exactly the same way that dozens of ships had perished in southern waters, alone, in the middle of a storm, with no time for rescue and with the cargo as executioner. The opening of the Panama Canal in 1914 radically transformed the geography of global maritime trade. Suddenly, ships traveling between the Atlantic and the Pacific had a 7-kilometer shortcut through the Central American Isthmus, avoiding the more than 12,000 additional nautical miles required to round Cape Horn. Routes that for centuries had condemned sailors to weeks of suffering became obsolete overnight for commercial navigation in the age of steam. However, the Panama Canal has insurmountable physical limits. The maximum size that could pass through its original locks was 294 meters in length and 32 meters in beam. The expansions inaugurated in 2016 raised that limit to 366 meters in length and 49 meters in beam. Ships that exceed those dimensions, called post-Panamax, have no alternative. If they want to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific through the Western Hemisphere, they have to round Cape Horn. This includes the largest supertankers, the biggest classes of container ships in the world, and some bulk carriers of extraordinary tonnage. This means that the Drake Passage has not fallen into disuse. Every year, between 2,000 and 3,000 ships use the Cape Horn route. Most of them are these large cargo vessels. Scientific research vessels and expedition cruise ships to Antarctica also use it. The difference from previous centuries is technology: satellite weather forecasting, GPS, steel hulls, engines that allow maintaining course against winds of 80 knots, and communications that can trigger a rescue within hours. But the physical conditions of the passage have not changed. The waves are still the same. Of all the navigation stories involving the Drake Passage, that of Ernest Shackleton and his rescue expedition of 1916 holds a special place, not because it is the largest shipwreck, nor the one with the most casualties, but because it was one of the most extraordinary survival journeys in history. The Endurance, Shackleton's ship, did not sink in the Drake Passage. It became trapped in the ice of the Weddell Sea, east of the Antarctic Peninsula. and was crushed by the pressure of the ice floes in November 1915. The 28 men of the crew spent months on the ice drifting northward, then sailed in 3 lifeboats to Elephant Island on the western edge of the Drake Passage. From Elephant Island, Shackleton assessed the situation. The island was deserted, outside all navigation routes, and with no possibility of a rescue ship finding it by chance. The only solution was to go for help. The nearest whaling station was on South Georgia Island, also known as San Pedro Island, more than 1,300 kilometers to the northeast across the South Atlantic. To get there, Shackleton would have to cross the Drake Passage and part of the South Atlantic in one of the lifeboats, the James Caird. An open boat, barely 6.9 meters long, with an improvised deck made of pieces of wood and canvas designed for coastal waters, not for the most violent ocean on the planet. On the 24th of April, 1916, Shackleton set out from Elephant Island with 5 men aboard the James Caird. Those left behind, 22 men, on a deserted island, watched until the boat disappeared among the waves. The 17 days that followed were a demonstration of what a human being can endure when the alternative is death. Inside the James Caird, the space under the improvised deck was barely the size of a closet. The men slept on soaked sleeping bags, on sacks of rock ballast, with water seeping in from all sides, splashing around their bodies. Chronic seasickness, the cold penetrating through every layer of clothing, the constant noise of water pounding the hull from outside and from inside, and the need to bail continuously so that the boat would not fill. For 17 days they sailed through the Drake Passage and the South Atlantic, with no possibility of real rest, because someone had to bail water constantly while the others tried to sleep. The waves capsized the boat on multiple occasions, forcing the crew to cling on and right it. Navigation depended on a sextant that could only be used in the brief moments when the sun appeared between the clouds, and the nautical charts for that region were of limited precision. The accumulation of ice on the hull threatened to sink the boat on at least 2 occasions, forcing the men to climb outside and chip the ice away by hand while the boat rocked in the swell. In one of those moments, Shackleton saw from the deck a wall of water that he thought was a gigantic wave. He raised the alarm. Only when the wall reached them did he realize that it was white from foam, not because it was the last. The boat survived. On the 10th of May, 1916, after 16 days of navigation, the James Caird reached South Georgia Island. What was extraordinary was not only having survived the crossing, it was the precision of the navigation. Without GPS, with a sextant used under extreme conditions, Frank Worsley, the navigator, brought the boat to within 20 kilometers of its target on an island 170 kilometers long, surrounded by open ocean. Any greater error would have meant passing it without seeing it and becoming lost in the South Atlantic with no possibility of correction. The 22 men who had remained on Elephant Island were rescued 3 months later. All survived. The account of that crossing of the Drake Passage in the James Caird is one of the most detailed documents that exist about what it means to be exposed to that ocean without any protection. Alfred Lansing, who decades later wrote the definitive chronicle of the expedition, described the Drake Passage as the most feared stretch of ocean on the planet. He did not use that expression as hyperbole. He used it as a technical description of the environment that Shackleton and his 5 men crossed in a boat the size of a garage. The sailor Frank Worsley, who had sailed all the seas of the world, wrote that this crossing was the most terrifying experience of his life. Worsley was someone who had spent decades at sea. His opinion about the Drake Passage carried specific weight. The seabed of the Drake Passage is one of the most complex on the planet from a geological point of view. The region sits on the Scotia Plate, a tectonic fragment positioned between the South American and Antarctic plates. The movements between these plates generate constant seismic activity. The depth in the deepest areas reaches between 4,000 and 4,800 meters. which means that most of the estimated 800 shipwrecks in these waters rest at depths far below the operational limits of conventional underwater exploration equipment. However, the coastal area of Tierra del Fuego and the adjacent islands has yielded some archaeological records. The low water temperatures slow biological degradation processes, which in theory allows the preservation of organic materials for longer periods than in other oceans. In the case of the San Telmo, this characteristic fuels the hope that identifiable remains may eventually appear. A researcher from the Maritime Museum of Ushuaia, identified some years ago, remains on the coasts of the area that could belong to the Huon. The ship of the Le Maire and Schouten expedition burned in 1616, which would make it the oldest shipwreck found in Argentina. There is also an unresolved dimension surrounding several missing ships whose cargo remains a historical enigma. The San Telmo carried on board an undetermined quantity of minted silver intended to pay the royalist troops in Callao. Records from the time mention this cargo obliquely, without specifying figures. If the remains of the ship are on the Antarctic coasts of Livingston Island, that silver would rest in one of the most inhospitable and remote environments on the planet. The Drake Passage is, among other things, a cemetery of riches that cold and depth have placed beyond the reach of civilization. In the 21st century, the Drake Passage has acquired a new meaning that transcends navigation. Oceanographers and climatologists consider it one of the most important systems on the planet for the regulation of the global climate. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current that crosses it acts as a mechanism for the distribution of heat and carbon on a global scale. Each year, the Southern Ocean, in which the passage plays a central role, absorbs around 600 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere, a process that depends on the ability of the currents to carry phytoplankton to depths where it can be sequestered for centuries. The irregularity of the seabed of the passage creates a particular phenomenon. When the circumpolar current passes over underwater mountains and ridges on the seabed, internal waves are generated that mix the layers of water with much greater intensity than in the open sea. This mixing is fundamental for the global thermohaline circulation, the great conveyor belt that moves heat and nutrients through all the oceans of the planet. Without the Drake Passage and the mixing it generates, that global circulation would be significantly weaker. Climate change is modifying these dynamics. The increase in water temperature in the southern oceans affects the patterns of the circumpolar current. The accelerated melting of Antarctica injects enormous volumes of cold, fresh water into the salty ocean, altering water density and interfering with thermohaline circulation mechanisms. If the Drake Passage is reconfigured, if warming reduces the temperature difference between Antarctic and subantarctic waters, models suggest that the circumpolar current could weaken, with cascading consequences for the climate of the entire southern hemisphere and beyond. Scientific and adventure tourism developing from the port of Ushuaia has turned the crossing of the Drake Passage into an experience accessible to a growing number of travelers. The Antarctic season moves tens of thousands of people aboard expedition cruises. The standard crossing takes between 48 and 72 hours. Experienced sailors distinguish two types of crossing: the Drake Shake, the crossing with waves between 4 and 8 meters that causes severe seasickness but does not represent real danger, and the Drake Lake, the infrequent crossing in which the passage is relatively calm. Veteran sailors distrust the Drake Lake. They know it can turn into Drake Shake within a few hours. Modern expedition ships are built with reinforced hulls for polar conditions, active stabilization systems, double hulls, and navigation equipment that includes high-resolution radar and side-scan sonar. Even so, emergencies occur. In 2022, a tourist cruise suffered passenger deaths when a large wave swept the deck. Technology reduces risk, but does not eliminate it. The Drake Passage remains what it has always been, a corridor of open water where the ocean shows its most extreme version. The Drake Passage does not only claim victims at sea. On the 9th of December 2019, a Lockheed C-130 Hercules aircraft of the Chilean Air Force took off from the Punta Arenas Air Base, bound for the Chilean Antarctic base Eduardo Frei Montalva in the South Shetland Islands. On board were 38 people, both military and civilians. The flight was to cross the airspace over the Drake Passage. Approximately 1 hour after takeoff, the C-130 disappeared from radar without emitting any distress signal and without the crew reporting any anomaly before the silence. Chilean authorities immediately launched a search operation involving 4 ships, numerous aircraft from several countries, and tracking satellites. Weather conditions, which were supposedly good at the time of takeoff, deteriorated rapidly during the rescue operations, illustrating the unpredictability that characterizes the region. The remains of the aircraft began to appear in the sea, fragments of fuselage, seats, pieces of equipment, and finally, human remains. All evidence pointed to a disintegration of the aircraft in the water, but the exact mechanism of the accident could not be determined with certainty. There was no fully recovered black box, no witnesses, and no distress signal. The C-130 is an aircraft designed for extreme conditions with decades of service in hostile zones around the world. Why it disintegrated in the Drake Passage remains, in formal terms, a not completely resolved case. Technical hypotheses include material fatigue, a sudden mechanical problem, or a localized meteorological condition of extreme severity. 38 people left no doubt. The Drake Passage remains lethal. At present, ships avoid the Drake Passage when they have an alternative because the Panama Canal, inaugurated in 1914, offers a 7-kilometer shortcut that avoids thousands of miles of hostile ocean. The history of the Drake Passage is, in part, the history of why that canal was built, with the human cost accumulated over 4 centuries of southern navigation as a backdrop. At the physical level, the answer is deeper. The Drake Passage is dangerous because the geography of the planet turned it into the only place where the 3 oceans of the southern hemisphere connect without land interrupting them. This generates the most powerful ocean current in the world, the most consistent winds, and the largest waves in navigable waters. There is no other stretch of sea on the planet where the same factors combine in the same way, with the same intensity, and throughout the year. Other seas of the world have severe conditions: the Bay of Biscay, the Strait of Malacca, the North Sea in winter, but none of them has the combination of the passage. Uninterrupted distance for winds to accumulate strength from thousands of kilometers of open sea, currents that concentrate their energy as they pass through the narrowest corridor of their circuit, and temperatures that make every accident potentially fatal. The instruments for survival changed. Knowledge of what lay beyond the Cape increased with each expedition that returned. Nautical charts improved. Steel ships replaced wooden ones. Engines gave captains the ability to maintain course regardless of the wind. Long-range communications, radar, GPS, satellite meteorology, all of this transformed the sailors' relationship with the Drake Passage. But the relationship did not disappear. The waves remain the same. The wind continues to blow in the same direction. Icebergs continue drifting north. The ships that do pass through the passage today, the post-Panamax vessels that do not fit in the canal, Antarctic cruises, and scientific research vessels, encounter the same ocean that Francisco de Hoces encountered in 1525, Le Maire and Shackleton in 1616, the 644 men of the San Telmo in 1819, and Shackleton in 1916. An ocean that has circulated around the coldest continent on the planet for 41 million years without anything stopping it, that concentrates its energy in the narrowest corridor of its route, and that does not distinguish between a 16th century caravel and a 21st century supertanker when it decides to show itself in all its violence. There is also a dimension that is rarely mentioned when speaking of the Drake Passage as a danger. It is also one of the most important natural systems for life on Earth. The current that crosses it regulates the temperature of Antarctica and keeps frozen the 26 million square kilometers of ice that stabilize global sea level. It is a thermostat of the planet. The same corridor of water that for centuries devoured ships and sailors is, at the same time, one of the reasons why sea level has not risen 59 meters. The most dangerous passage on the planet is also one of its most crucial self-regulation mechanisms. The sailing ships that in the 19th century took weeks to round the Cape, the Hercules that disappear without a trace, the lifeboats that somehow reached their destination, all are part of the same long and unfinished history of a passage that the planet opened millions of years ago, and that no canal built by engineering has been able, nor probably will ever be able, to fully replace. The Drake Passage exists because two continents separated millions of years ago. Human beings arrived much later, found that corridor in their path, and attempted to cross it. Some succeeded, many did not. And in that difference, not fully resolved either for past centuries or for the present, lies the story of what the ocean can do when it has no land to stop it.